Hello to everyone. My name is Alex Plishkov. I'm the head of the project on classical text and classical authors in ethical theory at HSC, Moscow, Russia. And this is our project series of discussion on philosophical ethics, the second conversation on classical ethics. Our guest today is Peter Singer, philosopher, professor of bioethics at Princeton University and a professor at the University of Melbourne. Professor Singer is the author of the classical works on ethics of our treatment of animals and the world poverty, and probably no less important, one of the inspirer of the modern animal rights movement and the effective altruism movement. Thus, Professor Singer is not only an eminent philosopher who hugely influenced the different fields of academic philosophy, but he is also one of the world's most influential intellectuals who affects the way we see and think about the world around us. It was the article Famine, Affluence and Morality by Peter Singer with which we started our translation project. Professor Singer, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be able to talk to you.
Great. So we have two question pools I would like to discuss with you today. First, roughly conceptual and theoretical questions. Second, concerning questions concerning philosophical theories and contemporary practices. And after that, we'll have a short and quick round of questions. Professor Singer, if you are ready, I'll give the floor to Sanjar Akayev. Sanjar, please.
Hello, Professor. So I will start with the first three questions. And the first one goes as follows. In your famous article, Famine, Affluence and Morality, you more or less made the problem of uncertainty of the outcomes of our moral actions. For example, you write that there are indeed some trustworthy international organizations that seek to help those in need, and that we should strive to at least trust some of them, although maybe not all. Looking at this problem several decades later, how would you assess the severity of this uncertainty problem? And do you think that the situation with trustworthy charities has improved over the last 50 years as the world became more globalized?
Thank you. Yes, looking back on my 1972 article, I was obviously fairly casual about evidence that the organizations are highly effective. I was thinking, I suppose, that these organizations are doing something, that it's better than doing nothing, but I didn't really think very much about the question as to which are the best organizations and how much difference is there between the best organization and one of the average organizations working in the same field. So things have definitely improved a lot, particularly in the last I suppose 15 years, anyway, somewhere between 10 and 15 years, because we've had research organizations, independent research organizations, assessing which are the most effective organizations. The pioneer in this field was GiveWell, but there are now others that are doing this. And The Life You Can Save, which I founded, tries to draw together some of the information from different organizations. So I think now we can be much more confident that some organizations are highly effective. And what I didn't realize when I wrote Famine, Affluence and Morality is that there is quite a big difference between the most effective organizations and just the average organizations in the field. It may be a factor of 10. It may in some areas be even significantly more than that. But that makes it very important to do this research and to find the most effective organization so that whatever you're doing does the most good.
Yeah, thank you. Following the topic of globalization, in the same article, Famine, Affluence and Morality, you mentioned that the premise that instant communication and modern transportation insert the development of the so-called global village should affect our moral intuition, and this effect should be recognized. However, most people still think in terms of imagined communities, which are contrasted with strangers or outsiders. So when we think of maximum utility, which community should we think of? How can we scale today's perception of utility for my people?
Well, I was perhaps a little optimistic about the global village making people think about strangers on the other side of the world, but I still think that we ought to be global in our thinking. That is, we ought not to give preference to our own community simply because these are people who are part of our community or are close to us. It it may depend on the country that one's in, but certainly if one is in an affluent country where there are either no or very few people living in extreme poverty, as that's defined by the World Bank, so living on roughly the purchasing power equivalent of what you can get for $2 a day in the United States, then I think it's important to reach out and find people who are at that extreme level of poverty, because and again this goes with my previous answer, you will find that you are doing much more good for a given sum of money, and in a way that's obvious when you think about it. If the poverty line in the United States for a family of four is somewhere around 23,000 US dollars. So if you have, let's say, $1,000 to donate, you're not going to make a really life-changing difference to raise the income of that family from 23,000 to 24,000. But if somebody's income is itself less than $1,000, as it is if they're on $2 a day, then you can make a really dramatic transforming difference by giving them $1,000. Now they could never afford to save that money before, and now they can do something with it. Maybe start a small business, maybe replace their leaky thatched roof with a corrugated iron roof, which will save them money in the long run anyway. All those things that they can do now that they couldn't do before.
Yeah, thank you again. And finally, I have two questions about different ethical theories, contemporary ethical theories. Nowadays, there is a challengeable tendency to create new approaches in contemporary ethics that combine different elements of classical normative ethics, normative theories. As a result, we may see such branches of utilitarianism as virtue utilitarianism. What do you personally think of such new approaches? Do they enrich and fit in the utilitarian framework, or are they rather chimeras of the classical theory because of their pretensions to take both sides and have it both ways?
I don't think they succeed in taking both sides and having it both ways, but I do think that they're new options for us to consider, which may or may not be something significant and important depending on the particular case. You mentioned virtue utilitarianism, and that can mean, in my understanding, that can mean two different things. One thing that it could mean is, whereas classical utilitarianism says we should do what will have the best consequences, and by best consequences we mean what will most promote the happiness or well-being and reduce the pain or suffering of all of those affected. And on one understanding of virtue utilitarianism, it is also consequentialist, like utilitarianism, but instead of saying what we should do is promote happiness and well-being, it says we should promote virtue or virtuous behavior. So it substitutes something different as the good to be promoted. So that's a possible theory. Then we need to discuss whether we should think that virtue is a good in itself, and a good that in fact is more important than happiness and well-being. The other possibility is that one can treat virtue utilitarianism as something analogous to rule utilitarianism. So the goal remains the same. That is, the goal remains well-being, but just as the rule utilitarian, well, some versions of rule utilitarianism may claim, we will do better at maximizing well-being if we encourage people to obey certain good moral rules, because people are not going to be very good at calculating in each case what action will have the best consequences. So virtue utilitarians in this sense of the term may say we should encourage people to be virtuous, to develop a virtuous character that will have these virtuous traits, and then they will in fact do more good, and there will be greater well-being in the world. So that's a kind of an empirical claim, and maybe there is something in that, at least a partial truth in that, even if not the whole truth. And that might be an interesting addition to discussions of utilitarianism.
Thank you. So now I give word to Valeria Kudryshova. She will give you the next set of questions.
Okay, thank you, and hello, Professor Singer. And I would like to start with some French ethical theories. Maybe you've heard about one French theory of minimal ethics by Roux and Augian, according to which our morality can be reduced to three main principles. The first one is no harm principle. The second principle is equality of everyone. And according to the third one, moral behavior is an attitude towards others and not towards oneself. Do you believe that this ethical theory or such a moral attitude can be only directed towards other people? Is it possible to be moral in relationships with others while being immoral in your private life? If so, what kind of morality is it? And do you agree that such an approach can be considered a challenge to some kind of moral paternalism? Or is it just the morality of a moral? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. I think that it's it's not a complete moral theory for a start. I mean, it's supposed to be a minimal moral theory, but the question is, why should we take up a minimal moral theory? Why should we stop at not harming people? Something like this idea has been around for a long time. There's a view known as negative utilitarianism. It was at one stage, I think, embraced by Karl Popper, and he embraced it because he saw how much harm had been done by totalitarian societies that he criticized in the open society and its enemies. And so he thought, basically governments as public policy shouldn't aim to produce utopias, they should just aim to minimize harm. And that may be a useful policy, but as a morality as a whole, it seems to me to be mistaken to think that we should only not harm. And in fact, the example that I use in Famine, Affluence and Morality, where I argue that you should save the drowning child in the shallow pond, arguably you could say, look, if I walk on and don't save the child, I haven't harmed the child. Or after all, I didn't push the child in the pond. I wasn't looking after the child. I didn't have the responsibility of seeing that this small child should not go near this pond. So I haven't harmed the child. So I think anybody would want to say, well, if you don't help somebody when you could and when otherwise they will drown, that's a kind of harm. But once you cross that barrier, then you have to say, well, why do you only stop at something that would be negative? Suppose that somebody was just okay, not in any terrible state, but you could easily make them very happy, just as easily as you could save the child. And that happiness would last and would not have any bad consequences. So I think that's what you should do in those circumstances. Now, you raised the objection about this being paternalist. I don't really see it as being paternalist. I think we would all like to be helped in various ways, and fortunately, people do help us every day. During the pandemic, for example, I know that people were helping others, particularly younger people who were at less risk were helping older people so that they didn't have to go shopping and expose themselves to the virus. And everybody seems to think that that was a good thing to do. So I don't think it was paternalistic. It was an offer. People were saying, would you like me to do your shopping? You could always say no and do your shopping yourself if you wanted to. So I don't see that helping is necessarily paternalistic. I think we have some good reasons for not being paternalistic, but that's not one of them. But let me say one more thing, because you asked this question about being immoral in your private life, and could you be good? But the question is, what is it that would be immoral in your private life that did not have bad consequences for someone else? Now, people used to make this distinction. Back in the 1950s, there was a debate in the United Kingdom about whether homosexuality should be illegal, should be a crime, as it was at that time. And some of the debates about that, there was a famous debate between H.L.A. Hart and Patrick Devlin. Some of the debates about that seemed to assume that homosexuality is immoral. And so the debate was then, should the law enforce morality? That was the way Devlin certainly saw it. But I think a better view of that particular issue is to say, look, homosexual acts between consenting adults don't hurt anybody. So they're not immoral. Why should we think of that as immoral? And the same for other so-called victimless crimes. I don't think that these are immoralities in one's private life. So I don't really accept this idea of harmless immorality or immorality that doesn't affect others in your private life. That seems to me to be a mistake.
Thank you for your reflections. I will have a lot to think about. Okay, and now I would like to continue with the second set of our questions dedicated to theory and practice. You famously spoke about the connection between theory and practice, philosophical discussions, and political actions. In Famine, Affluence, and Morality, you mentioned philosophy teachers and students who should take their discussions seriously and act on them. In your opinion, do courses on practical ethics or predominance of the text of applied ethics in syllabuses have a bigger impact on the practical decisions of students and, of course, professors than the ones that focus on texts belonging to normative and meta-ethical areas, or the history of philosophy and ethics? If the answer is positive, would you advocate for applied ethics courses in different universities, programs, or curriculums? And finally, how do you think one can engage the broader public in these discussions, and is it necessary at all? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question too. So I suppose it depends a bit on the classical texts. It's possible that if you read Plato, you will be inspired by the example of Socrates to challenge people who think that they know what justice is, but really once you ask them a few probing questions, they become confused and realize they don't know. So I think that classical texts certainly can lead people to change their behavior, but it's hard to know. We don't really know. And in fact, if you'd asked me this question even as recently as a year ago, I would have had to say, that my evidence that practical ethics changes people's behavior is only anecdotal. But quite recently, just last year, I published together with a colleague, or two colleagues, Eric Schwitzgabel and Brad Cokelet, an article in the psychology journal Cognition, which was a controlled study, I think the first ever controlled study of showing an effect of an applied ethics course, or more specifically, of a section of an applied ethics course on animal ethics and the ethics of eating meat. And what we did was we took some very large classes and we signed up, students sign up as well as the big lectures. They sign up for smaller discussion groups of about a dozen people. And those discussion groups are taught by graduate students usually. And then we randomly selected half of the discussion groups to have a particular section on the ethics of eating meat, and the other half to have a section on the ethics of giving to charity and global poverty. Now, we were not actually able to test the effect of the global poverty one, but what we were able to test was the effect of the eating meat class, because students at this university, it's the University of California at Riverside, often buy their meals at the student cafeteria, and they use their student ID card to pay for the meals. They have a balance on the ID card. So we were able to get data on all of the students in the course and to see how many of their purchases involved meat. And we did find a significant difference after the discussion. And carrying on for a few months, actually, we found a statistically significant drop in meat purchases in those who'd had the classes on meat ethics. It wasn't huge. It wasn't like they all became vegetarians or anything like that, but there was a drop, more than you could get by chance, as I say, statistically significant. So so I like that result, because it does show that there is some evidence that practical ethics really can change people's behavior, even in something as fundamental as what they eat.
Okay, thank you. And my last question is again about some convergence between practice and theory. As we know, utilitarianism is definitely a practice-oriented theory that we can see by the effective altruism movement, for example. In your opinion, should a contemporary ethical theory be always linked to some practical activity and be socially grounded? Is there still some place for pure philosophical theory in some way? And my question arises due to some inner and outer features. Firstly, we all know about this usual distinction between, let's say, philosophizing and acting, although I believe that this can be easily denied by the examples in applied ethics. Secondly, an internal attempt to find the answer to the question whether philosophy exists for itself or whether it should react to some global events and give some kind of guidance to people, helping them to reflect on contemporary agenda. For example, in this, let's say, time of COVID-19. And thirdly, an attempt to make some philosophical ideas popular so that they can be articulated in our everyday life. And what do you think about this? Thank you.
Thank you. So I do think that there's room for some philosophizing about and even about ethics that doesn't have a practical outcome. For example, we can ask the question, is ethics objective? Are some ethical views more justifiable, perhaps have better reasons for them than other ethical views? And that we can discuss that while leaving it open what might be the most justifiable theory. So this is a distinction between what we call meta-ethics and normative ethics, and normative or applied ethics together in that. And there's been some excellent work done in that area. Even quite recently, Derek Parfit's major 3-volume work on what matters is mostly about that question, and not specifically actually about, you don't really learn what Parfit thinks does matter from the first 3 volumes of On What Matters. He planned a 4th volume, which unfortunately he died prematurely and was not able to complete, but maybe then we would have learned more. So yes, there can be very good philosophizing. I think that is an excellent example, without actually having a practical outcome as to what you should do. But I do think that in a sense, it is important, and it's central to ethics, that we look to ethics for guidance of some kind on how we ought to live. And it might be fairly broad guidance. It might be guidance about, saying, well, try to maximize well-being. And then, of course, there's lots of questions about what well-being consists in and how we best maximize it. So it doesn't always give you very specific answers. Or, as in the case of applied ethics or practical ethics, it may, as obviously I've argued for very specific things that you ought to do in areas like what you eat and what you do with money that you don't need for your own basic needs. So to me, that seems, if ethics never had any impact at that level, if ethics never affected how anybody behaved, it might still be intellectually interesting, but it wouldn't be more worth pursuing than let's say the game of chess, which is a wonderful game and great intellectual challenges can come into chess, but ultimately I think philosophy is more important than chess, and so that's why I think that we do want to make sure that at some point philosophy has this kind of cutting edge where it affects how we ought to live, and I think it's important to convey that to students and to help them to see that that's the ultimate point of doing ethics, is that we want to think about how we ought to live.
Thank you, Professor Singer, for capturing meditations. And now I would like to give the floor to Alex Pleshkov for some kind of short set of round questions and some final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singer. So if you don't mind, before we turn to this short round of questions, may I ask one extra questions, continuing the questions by Lera?
Of course, sure.
So I'm really curious about, you said that sometimes classical text helps us because give us good moral exemplars, but what do you think about the very status of classical text? So I mean that in the last decades there were a lot of discussions about whom we call classical philosophers, who should be in the philosophical canon. And so you said that some philosophers could be helpful, could give us good examples of moral behavior. But is there some classical authors who could be, harmful, who will, and it will be better to reduce them from the university's curriculum and so on? What is about the very nature of classical text in philosophy in your mind, and how do you feel about shifts and change in the philosophical canon?
I think it's part of being an educated person that you know something about people who have been the great philosophers of the past, and I think that we can often learn from them. I think that we might disagree with them quite strongly, but that's not necessarily a reason for not reading them and not studying them, not seeing where they went wrong. So Aristotle is a good example here. Aristotle justifies slavery. He thinks that the less rational should serve the more rational. He thinks that the Greeks were the most rational, and therefore it was fine for the Greeks to enslave the barbarians, as he called the non-Greeks. Obviously, we should reject that. Does that mean that Aristotle is not worth reading? No. There are many other things that Aristotle says that are interesting and defensible. But if that was all that he'd said, then it wouldn't be worth reading. I think we would just say, well, this is obviously the bias of somebody who enjoys a comfortable life with slaves to do what he wants. And there can be other texts like that which are also racist in various ways. There can be texts that are sexist. In fact, great number of philosophers were sexist in their attitudes. And again, we should reject that, but we may still have things to learn from those philosophers, or we may just be good to understand how people who in many ways were thoughtful and intelligent could be subject to those prejudices or views that they have. And of course, from my perspective, really almost every philosopher up to the 18th century who talked about animals got that very seriously wrong. But again, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't read them. So I don't think we should therefore try to purify the canon by throwing out, some people might want to, throwing out the white males who dominated and trying to find people who are neither white nor male to replace them with. Of course, we have good philosophers who are neither white nor male, they should be in the canon, and we may realize that they were excluded from the canon, not because of any lack of merit or interest in what they were saying, but simply because the white males just wouldn't listen to them or wouldn't take them seriously. That's possible. But that's different from saying somehow, well, we just have to have equal numbers of people of different races and the different sexes in the philosophical canon. If for various reasons there just were not so many people who were neither white nor male writing philosophy, and therefore we don't have their works, we shouldn't try to drag up works which maybe are not of as great interest as the works that we have. Reject other works of more interest. Sorry, you're muted, Alex. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. And I mean, we think a lot about this classical status and what to do with, you know, uncomfortable classical authors. But in fact, I completely agree with your position. Now we can turn to our quick round of questions. So the first one is, who would you call the classical philosopher par excellence? Is so persons?
It depends a little what you mean. I mean, in one sense, I think it's Plato, because Plato really stands at the beginning of this tradition, and you know, Plato or Socrates, you know, to what we don't really know to what extent the dialogues are historical, but the Platonic Socrates is clearly a figure who is doing something that we recognize that activity, and it's different from other earlier texts which don't have that kind of interrogatory form that the Platonic dialogues have. So that's why I mention him. But if you want to look at the philosopher, if you can consider him classical philosopher, that I most admire and that I think exemplifies some of the virtues of careful scholarly examination of questions, I'm a great admirer of Henry Sidgwick, the late 19th century utilitarian philosopher, who I think was a much better philosopher than John Stuart Mill, although Mill is better known and Mill wrote better, and I certainly admire Mill's work on liberty and on the subjection of women. But if you look at Mill's utilitarianism and compare that to Sidgwick's methods of ethics, it's like night and day. Sidgwick is just so much more careful in establishing what he wants to argue and defend. So I'll name Sidgwick as my favorite classical philosopher.
Okay, thank you. Partly you answered to the second short question, but maybe you can mention some philosophers alive. And who is your favorite philosopher as such, even if not classical philosopher?
Well, I've already mentioned Derek Parfit. I was fortunate in knowing Derek quite well. When I went to Oxford as a graduate student in 1969, he was already teaching there, though he was only, 3 or 4 years older than me. But his classes were really eye-opening. He was doing the work on population ethics, that is in part 4 of Reasons and Persons, and I had never heard or thought about these questions, and suddenly there was this whole new field of questions that was opened up. And he continued, I think, to do wonderful work on personal identity and the nature of self-interest and a range of different areas, including, as I mentioned, in his last major work about objectivity and the role of reason in ethics. I was certainly influenced by the personal encounter, because I really had the feeling when I was talking to Derek about something that whatever I had said, he had already thought of. Not only had he thought of it, he'd thought of how to reply to it, and he'd thought of how I might respond to his reply, and he had a reply to that. So in that sense, I made the comparison with chess a moment ago. It was a little bit like playing with a grandmaster who had imagined everything that I could do and already had a good response to it. And I haven't really had that feeling with other philosophers. So that's why I put him at the top of my ladder of outstanding philosophers that I've had contact with.
Thank you very much. And the next question is about the nearest future of philosophy as a discipline. What would you call the most important philosophical issue or issues for the next 10 years?
Well, as you know, I work in ethics, and so to me, the most important issues for the next decade are going to be issues in ethics. And there are always questions about what philosophy can contribute and what is contributed in other ways. Clearly, the world faces a huge problem with climate change and the disruption of weather patterns around the world. We don't fully know what impact that will have, but it seems likely that it will have a devastating impact both on people and on animals. There are philosophical issues in climate change, including the allocation of emissions, quotas to emit among nations. Should poorer nations have larger quotas than wealthier nations? What is the principles on which we should decide these things? There's been a fairly lively discussion about that. I've tried to contribute to it in my book, One World, and also in the chapter on climate in practical ethics. So that seems to me to be a big issue. Obviously, the other issues that I've talked about, global poverty is still there and could be made worse by climate change. The treatment of animals is actually just increased, sadly, on the mistreatment of animals since I wrote Animal Liberation, although to some extent we have, or some people have more enlightened attitudes to animals. When you take into account the fact that nations like China are now producing many times the quantity of meat that they were producing in 1970s, because they've got more prosperous, which is good, but this is a very unfortunate consequence of it. So we have billions more, tens of billions more animals in factory farms than was the case in the 1970s, and that's still a huge problem that I think needs to be tackled.
Thank you. And the last short question. So we are quite young research group, so we are interested in different forms and new media. So the last question, are there online resources from university encyclopedias to YouTube channels you would advise to follow for those interested in philosophy and ethics in particular?
I probably find the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy the most valuable online resource. I find I'm often going to it. It has articles of high quality. They're well referenced, and it now covers a very wide range of subjects. So I find that excellent. Obviously, Wikipedia has some articles too, but the quality is much more varied. But Wikipedia is quite an amazing achievement, I think. That one can produce such a vast body of knowledge, or nearly knowledge anyway. YouTube, I haven't looked at a lot of philosophy on YouTube, I have to say. I have a teenage grandson who I wanted to introduce to philosophy, and I found something called a Crash Course on Philosophy by somebody called Hank Green. He speaks very, very quickly. It might be hard for non-native speakers of English to keep up with him, but basically that's not bad. It gives you very quick accounts of big philosophical issues in 10 or 15 minutes, something like that.
Okay, thank you. I think he's quite popular in Russia as well.
Oh, is he? Okay, all right. So maybe just speaking quickly isn't such a problem.
And I believe that he even has the Russian subtitles, so it's much.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Professor Singer. It was really our good luck that you accepted our invitation, and it is so nice to speak to you in person, because you are one of the classical authors we try to make possible to read in Russian, and it is really great for us to talk to you about some issues that we are interested while we questioned while we were reading your works. So thank you so much for your time, for your kind attitude. Yeah, we are really
Yeah. Yeah, you're very welcome, and I'm happy to do this because I felt actually for a long time that it's a little strange that there's been so little contact between Western philosophers like myself and philosophy in Russia, and I was a bit puzzled by this. And until quite recently, none of my books were translated into Russian, although they'd been translated into many other languages, including not just European languages, but some Asian languages, for example. But it is starting to happen that some of my work is getting into Russian, so that's nice, and I hope that we will have more contact in coming years.
great. Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much then.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you, Professor Singer. Bye.